I really want to hear about your entrepreneurial journey, because you haven't always been in, the crypto industry working with mining. You've been an entrepreneur and done other things before that. And one of the things that seems like a very interesting topic that I've actually never really dove in depth in is the entertainment industry. And that's one part of the conversation that I want to dive into initially. So maybe let's start by having you talk about the earlier stages of your entrepreneurial journey. And then whenever it gets into that, promotion aspect, we can start diving into some of the details. I'm personally just very, very curious how that world works, because I see it from the outside. It seems very opaque. And I feel like now I get to talk with someone who is on the inside and get the inside scoop here.
How did I land in that industry? It was a lot of, it was ultimately going back to the question that I had mentioned that I typically share with others when it comes to risk in life and the evaluation of risk, which is just asking what your why is. Like, what's your motivator in life, right? So I took a couple different things that led me in the music industry. I took what my why was, which I'll share in a moment. And then number two, I took that general life philosophy as I'm here for a reason. And my first step in this journey is discovering what that reason is. Right. And I knew at a young age that what I really, really enjoyed doing was not necessarily being the person who had the great idea. And that was it was such a humbling experience to realize that I may not be that person. That may not be my gift. Being the innovator and the ideator may not be necessarily where my skill sets lie. A lot more I've discovered over time that a lot more of what I've been gifted with is the ability to integrate with others who have great ideas and are great thinkers, right? And so when it came to the music industry, that just felt like a really natural fit, because you have such an abundance of creators, but you don't have necessarily an abundance of facilitators, right? With every great creator, you need to take their canvas that may be the size of a building and bring it all the way down to an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper and say, no, I want you to fit all of your ideas onto this, versus just let them run for infinity. And so that's what kind of initially drew me towards the industry. Was I saw an opportunity, number one, to work towards my reason, and number two, to really start to nurture this skill that I was interested in, which was becoming a facilitator of great creatives. And thanks to the internet, we can have, for example, for Will to start a podcast, he doesn't need Joe Rogan to say, hey, Will can start a podcast. Will can just start the podcast. So for me, I said, I'm just going to go try a blog out. And I launched this kind of blog, right? And I initially started just by kind of pouring out some of my thoughts, opinions on new artists, the industry as a whole. I was really plugged into the electronic dance community at the time, so I kind of had a sense of what was happening in the space. And I took a totally different perspective in that industry versus being, the guy that would go to shows and take all of these wild substances. I was really studying the business behind these concerts and these experiences and who was forming them. So I started to write on those. And then ultimately that led me to partnering up with a group that was actually putting on those concerts. I met the CEO. I started to talk with him at a couple of the shows I was at. And I was really captivated by what he was doing. We ended up forming a relationship. And through that process, one of my closest friends growing up and he and I said, hey, Kyle, what if we just went and tried this on our own? We saw that this guy, Brandon, can do it with his company. What if we just attempted to do the same thing? It doesn't seem overly complex, the concept of putting on a concert. And so that led to the formation of one of my first formal companies, which is a company called Beats for Better that I founded years ago. And the concept behind Beats for Better was twofold. So number one, we wanted to put on concerts. We thought the idea was really cool. I was already a little bit plugged into the space at the time. We knew a lot of artists. We'd been around the community for a while. And we just wanted to give the opportunity really for young talent to have a platform that they could show themselves off on. Because again, the hardest things for creatives is to facilitate their creativity into a business. So I was really, really drawn by that. And then, the second piece of it too is we had a philanthropic component that we really believed in. We believed that artists were missing a couple of different things, and one of the big things that we felt like artists were missing is that there's a lot of talent within the U.S. and abroad that just isn't ever tapped into because the opportunity is not provided. I mean, think about how many Taylor Swifts probably never become Taylor Swift because they grow up in a low-income community. There isn't a strong music program at their school, so there's never exposed. And unfortunately, that idea ends up dying and that passion ends up turning into nothing.
I'm very curious as to how the structuring and negotiations between the creatives and the actual companies operates, because you always hear about these companies and these creatives, and you hear about these stories where things don't go really well, right? And I think it goes back to what you mentioned, where you can be a young, very talented singer or DJ, whatever you may be, and you'll just run into a very savvy businessman or a very savvy company that understands the ins and outs and negotiated hundreds of contracts, and you're out there, it's your first time, you know you're good, but you have no idea what's going on. You're most likely
Yeah.
struggling financially, and you are almost reliant on one of these companies.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, I think a lot of it will feel very similar to the startup tech space, right? Because ultimately that's what these two industries are. They're two industries that both have, I mean, both technology and entertainment have been around for a really, really long time, but there's constantly new people that are trying to enter into the space, right? So unlike, consumer goods, like unlike like Kleenex, for example, which is, or Clorox, these businesses that have been around for hundreds of years, very little innovation in the space. Tech and entertainment are constantly changing, right? And so because of that, you constantly get new participants, and new participants always means more industry vulnerability, right? Because it means someone's probably going to get hurt because someone who's been around is going to try to take advantage of them. It's unfortunately the nature of a capitalistic society, and it's also unfortunately the nature of a creative, because creatives typically want one thing: push their message out to the world as much and as far as they can. Getting back to your question, though, about where I've seen this actually play out in the course of my life, I mean, a classic example was actually my college roommate. So he was a really talented musician in high school, had this band that he had formed, and they were to the point where they were getting national notoriety. And this is, by the way, pre-SoundCloud, pre-TikTok, pre all that. I mean, those platforms were really, really early stage at the time, because this was several years ago. So he starts his band in high school, doing really well. One of the major labels, I think it was Republic, I can't remember who it was, came to him and said, "Hey, we really like what you're doing. We want to give you a 3-album deal. But here's the problem." And again, this is the challenge with these young entrepreneurs. I put it in quotes because they're artists, but they really are entrepreneurs because they're responsible for protecting their businesses. So this major label comes to them and says, "Hey, we really like what you did. We want to give you a 3-album deal, but here are the terms of the deal." And this is something in the industry known as a 360 contract. They're very, very common in the music industry. They're also very common in other entertainment, other sectors of the entertainment industry. But a 360 deal is basically exactly what it sounds like. In this case, the record label comes in and they say, "We're going to take all creative rights from your work for these 3 albums. You're basically going to commit to us 3 albums. We own your name, your likeness, your brand, everything for these 3 albums. Once the 3 albums are produced, we let you off the hook. You can have all of your creative freedom back." Right now, here's where these artists get in trouble. So they sign into a deal like that, and this is exactly what happened to my friend Steven. They signed to a deal like that, and the record label says, "Awesome, we think you're doing great. Here's a budget for your first album. Go shoot a couple music videos, have a lot of fun with it," right? And then they come back and they say, "Okay, great, album's done, music videos are done. Let's go put this out in the world." And they put it out in the world, and it doesn't do very well, right? And the audience doesn't receive it very well. They go back to the record label, and in a traditional startup world, that's called product testing. So we put our product out in the world. The world says, "We don't love it. Great, bring the product back. Let's refine it, clean it up, and kick it out again." It doesn't work like that in the music industry. Product goes out, doesn't work, comes back to the record label. "Hey, record label, we need another 400 grand to produce another album, more music videos, et cetera, to go test the audience again." The record label says, "We didn't really like our return on invested capital for that first album. So we're going to wait for a little bit." And in the world of a 360 contract, waiting can be years, right? So an artist can say, "I'm ready for the second album," and the record label can say, "We're just going to wait on it for a couple of years." Well, what happens to a lot of artists happened to my friend Steven, where they shelf you, right? And they say, "We'll get back to you when we're ready." And what ends up happening is they never get back to you.
So one final question on this, and then we can start moving into the more crypto, Bitcoin focused conversation.
Hey, I enjoy this.
This is
man.
like
We talk about mining
very
enough,
selfish
right?
on. Yeah, like I just like have been so curious about this. And after seeing that was your background, it's like I have to dive into this with you. What is one thing that you can leave me and the rest of the listeners with before we put this topic to bed?
In regards to the music industry?
In regards to the music industry, yeah. And
Yeah,
one final piece that might be interesting as well is if you have any predictions for the future, just because I know that it's evolved so much over, like you mentioned, it's like the tech industry. There's just so many new technologies. People are leveraging them in different ways. You have a different market dynamic once these new technologies come in. So from your point of view and your background, I'm curious if there's anything that you can share there.
It's an awesome question, Will. It really is an awesome question, because as you can probably tell from the earlier phase of this conversation, a lot of the ways that I approach life is philosophical and then philanthropic, right? So I look at it from both perspectives. And, when it comes to the music industry, I really, really strongly believe that what will ultimately carry the torch of the light of humanity will be creatives, because a lot of the non-creative components of humans will end up in the hands of AI. right? So no longer is the ability to write a fast email or negotiate well in a sales call really be that valuable to us in 50, 60, 70 years, because a lot of that stuff's going to be taken over. I mean, I went to Chat GPT the other day and said, hey, write me a pitch email. And it was pretty good. It was pretty good.
It was
And
crazy.
so it just goes to show that the ones that will carry the torch of the light of humanity are going to be creatives. And so that's why I always encourage people to tap in their creative brains. But the second piece is, you have to be really focused, if you want humanity's light to be carried, on supporting creatives, and particularly independent creatives. So what I would leave your listeners with is, if you have the opportunity to support an independent creator, remember that you're not just doing it to launch their career, you're actually doing it to carry, again, the light of humanity forward. Creatives don't very rarely receive words of affirmation. They very rarely receive monetary donations as well. But if you get the opportunity to impact a creator's life, I always highly recommend it, because it's such a critical component of our future. And then the second thing, of course, too, is just tap into your own creativity as well. There's so many people that have said to me before, and this is an adage that unfortunately gets repeated throughout our society, which is that I'm not creative. Well, everyone's creative in some way. And you may not realize it, but creativity can appear in a lot of different forms of your life. It can appear in the way that you write, the way you speak, the way that you cook, the way that you eat, the types of relationships you build. I mean, creativity is not just necessarily consolidated all the way back to just painting and drawing and playing music and et cetera. So tap into your own creativity and support the creativity of others, because it's so incredibly important in carrying, again, forward the torch that is the light of humanity. So that's just so incredibly important to me to share. Now, secondarily, that kind of leans into, what does the future of this world look like, right? And I think the reality is that the entertainment industry as a whole is going to follow the same trends that we're seeing in other industries. They're just going to leverage the technologies that are appearing and being developed in other places. So when you think about things like artificial intelligence, virtual reality, when you think about really more all of that combined together, you see it as immersive experiences. And I feel like that's the future of entertainment in a lot of ways, is how much more immersive can we get? We're already at a stage where we have things like limited forms of virtual reality. We have really immersive movie experiences, with IMAX, for example. Now you go to certain theme parks and they have both those components integrated into them. So I think it's just going to become more and more immersive. And then as it becomes more immersive, it's going to, of course, become more custom and tailored specific to the individual. So now when you go to a theme park of the future, it's going to be, I'm going to put on my VR mask and everything around me is going to be tailored to my likes and desires.
Inflation is transitory.